In February 2022, Vladimir Putin ordered an invasion of Ukraine based on a series of premises that have no grounding in reality, but offer us insight into the true reason for the invasion. As the war has progressed, however, the Russian military has suffered failure after failure, escalating the war from what was described as a special military operation to a conflict that has seen Russia partially transition into a wartime economy, with the mobilization of over 300,000 men and recruitment of prisoners to fight in the war. This significant cost, this tarnishing of Putin's image from one of the world's most cunning and methodical strategists to a delusional and frightened cornered animal. This collapse of Russia from a nation that was considered a peer to a superpower like the United States to one with a collapsing economy and a military already destroyed by a failed invasion. All of this had to have been for a reason, right? For us to understand what that reason is, we need to look deeper into the life and presidency of Vladimir Putin and the way he viewed the world. His story, while shrouded in mystery and lies, gives us enough truth to understand why the war happened. We need to take a trip inside the mind of Vladimir Putin.
Tear down this wall.
When the Berlin Wall fell, Vladimir Putin was an officer in the KGB in Dresden. At 37 years old, he watched with rage as the German crowd surrounded the KGB headquarters where he and a number of other KGB officers were. Nestled inside the East German Stasi compound, the crowd had already shown that the Soviet era was over. This was, as Putin would later describe it, one of the greatest geopolitical catastrophes of the 20th century. This moment is considered one of the most important moments in understanding Vladimir Putin. After growing up idolizing the KGB, he had finally had his chance to serve the Soviet Union, with his first posting abroad being in Dresden. And almost in an instant, the empire he worshipped had come crumbling down. As the crowd breached the compound and approached the KGB HQ, Putin would confront the crowd with a tool that would become one of his greatest assets: a lie. He told the crowd that his comrades inside the HQ were heavily armed and were prepared to shoot the crowd if they did not vacate the compound. In fact, they were not heavily armed, and nobody was coming to help them if the crowd indeed turned on him and overran the KGB HQ. Instead, the crowd believed him and left the compound. This story would later become a heroic moment in Putin's history within the Kremlin narrative. However, the moment didn't change the fact that in 1991, the Soviet Union would collapse and Putin would find himself in the rubble of his beloved empire. As Russia attempted to reinvent itself in the image of a democracy under President Boris Yeltsin, Putin worked his way from the KGB to the role of deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. While working his way up, Putin would watch as Russia would struggle to command the respect it had during the Soviet years. From a president with a penchant for drinking and enjoying the White House lawn, to the US intervening in Bosnia and the humiliating failures of the First Chechen War, Putin would vow to never let Russia become a second or even third-rate power. He would bring Russia back. Putin was appointed in 1999 as Boris Yeltsin's prime minister, a post which brought him out of the shadows. While in this position, Putin would again use the asset that likely saved the lives of himself and his comrades a decade before. This would happen when he accused Chechen separatists for a bombing of Moscow apartment buildings. This provided the pretext for Russia to re-engage in Chechnya in what became the Second Chechen War. Despite this, there is no evidence that the Chechens were in fact involved in that apartment bombing. In 2000, Boris Yeltsin, dealing with mounting pressure and in desperate need of an ally, would pass authority to Vladimir Putin in exchange for pardons and immunity from prosecution. With Yeltsin's fate in the hands of Vladimir Putin, it was time for Putin to finally begin his work. Vladimir Putin's presidency brought dramatic changes to Russia. From the beginning, Putin sought to renew Russia's place as a global superpower. That said, his work was cut out for him. From a damaged economy to a military in desperate need of modernization to immediate threats in Russia's near abroad, Putin would have to bring Russia back from the lowest point it had been in since its civil war. Through the early 2000s, Putin would enact dramatic reforms that would see the Russian economy modernized and join the World Trade Organization in 2011. He would also consolidate power, quashing the insurgency left behind from the Second Chechen War and warming the relationship with the US and the West. This would, however, hit a turn backward in 2008 when Russia would intervene in Georgia and annex parts of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. At this time, Putin was back in the role of prime minister with his ally Dmitry Medvedev in as president. They would swap jobs in 2012 when Putin would take his third term as president and Medvedev Medvedev would become his prime minister. After the 2008 annexation of Georgia, tension would resume between the West and Russia. This would be followed by Putin's banning of Russian children from being adopted by US citizens in 2009 to the acceptance of NSA leaker Edward Snowden in 2013, and would hit its lowest point again in 2014. 2014 was a year in which Putin's silent ambitions for empire began to fall apart in Ukraine. As Putin worked in the Russian government in the 1990s, Ukraine would undergo transformations of its own. Now a free country and in possession of a large portion of the Soviet nuclear stockpile, Ukraine was left in a difficult position. This position would be relieved in 1994 with the Budapest Memorandum, which saw Ukraine return the Soviet nuclear weapons back to Russia in exchange for security guarantees from both the United States and Russia. While this was a hopeful moment in 1994, it would prove to be a fateful and incisive moment as time went on. In 2004, the Orange Revolution swept across Ukraine as the population decried widespread voter fraud in an election between pro-Russian candidate Viktor Yanukovych and pro-Western candidate Viktor Yushchenko. Yushchenko would win the election in a runoff, but would later suffer dioxin poisoning by associates who would later flee to Russia. He would survive and go on to seek closer ties with the United States while outwardly considering expelling Russia's Black Sea Fleet from its port in Sevastopol, its only warm water port in Europe. In 2010, Viktor Yanukovych would become president of Ukraine, seeking closer ties with Russia. His presidency would include rampant corruption and the denial of an EU acceptance bid. These moves would prove unpopular, and in January 2014, the Ukrainian people acted. This movement would later be known as the Maidan Revolution, or the Revolution of Dignity among Ukrainians. It was an attempt by the Ukrainian people to preserve their national identity and sovereignty in what they believed was an assault from Russian interests, rampant corruption, police brutality, and oligarchic influence. This attempt would prove successful. As Yanukovych fled to Russia, Petro Poroshenko became the new Ukrainian president. The Maidan Revolution wasn't just an incisive moment for Ukraine. It was a turning point for Vladimir Putin. After over a decade of trying to keep Ukraine away from the European Union and NATO covertly, he had to act militarily. In February, little green men appeared in Crimea, as well as segments in Donetsk and Luhansk. While they wore no flag patches, they arrived from the direction of Russia, spoke the Russian language, used Russian equipment, flew the Russian flag, and in the case of Crimea, outright annexed the province into Russia proper. Donetsk and Luhansk would become separatist republics, and Ukraine would fight viciously against the first invasion throughout the Donbass. It was here in the Donbass, in places like the Donetsk airport, that Ukraine learned that it was capable of fighting Russia. But it was in Crimea where Russia learned that it was capable of seizing Ukraine. This dramatic series of events solidified the direction that Russian relations with the West were headed. Numerous sanctions were imposed, and Putin would begin to use the West more frequently as a scapegoat for domestic resistance to his rule. Putin would still remain undeterred in his resolve to remake Russia into the empire he believed it could be. He would begin sharing his theory on a multipolar world order, in which global power wouldn't just sit in Washington, D.C., but also in Moscow, Beijing, and other capitals. He would have allies as well. From the close relationship with China's President Xi Jinping that would be characterized as a bromance, Putin and Xi would share the vision of a world where the United States would not be the premier global superpower. He would have his friendships challenged. When the Arab Spring swept across the Middle East, toppling dictators and creating the instability that would go to form ISIS, a Russian ally, Syria would enter into a brutal civil war, in which the battlefield would often be split among multiple factions, each vying for their own territory. Vladimir Putin would safeguard his ally from US intervention in 2015, instead entering Russian forces into the war themselves. This intervention was Putin's first expeditionary intervention into a foreign war, and it was his chance to prove Russia was back on the world stage as a first-rate power. Still, however, Russia would resort to the brutal tactics that characterized the Soviet era, from the bombing of hospitals to the gassing of civilians, all in an effort to secure Assad's reign in power. The war would take many forms, but it would ultimately slow down. It wouldn't slow down, however, until after US troops had entered Syria as part of an anti-ISIS coalition along with other partners. Russia and the US would run joint patrols in Syria, but this wouldn't prevent Putin from testing American resolve. Seeing the US as a waning power, he would allow Wagner, a private paramilitary force based out of Russia, to attempt an assault on a US firebase in Syria. It would end in a complete disaster, with hundreds of Wagner mercenaries slaughtered from indirect fire and airstrikes with 0 US casualties. This resulted result stunned the Wagner survivors, and no test on US resolve in Syria would happen again. This, however, would not deter Putin from testing the US though. He was engaged in 2 wars, from Ukraine to Syria. He had proven he could assist his allies from threats to their regime. However, he still had a significant challenge on his hands: Ukraine. As Russia engaged in its expeditionary involvement in Syria, Ukraine would receive help from the West. While fighting in Donbass against Russian forces, Ukrainian soldiers would also be trained by NATO advisors, developing their military from one that had been embarrassed and helpless in Crimea to one that stood ready to face Russia. Problems continued to exist though, from rampant corruption to a technological disparity with Russia that could undermine all the progress being made. Still, Ukraine worked to prepare for its next fight, as Putin prepared for his. All of this, though, would freeze in an instant when a virus froze the world. Vladimir Putin had always been a paranoid man. After a career in Russia's intelligence community, he had learned how to keep secrets, and why one should not allow too many too close. This would all reach extreme lengths when the COVID pandemic hit. While he normally kept a small inner circle, his close contacts immediately shrunk to just a handful. With no outlet to direct his special asset that saved his life in 1989 and that helped again in 2000, the lies and deception would turn inward. A false history held by Putin, one that disregarded Ukraine's national identity, and one that blamed NATO for interfering in Ukraine and Russia, outright dismissing his own history of interfering in Ukraine in 2004 and again in 2014. This isolation and growing detachment from reality led to Putin's publishing of a nearly 5,000-word article on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians in 2021. In it, Putin would lay his ambitions bare. He intended to make Russia a superpower, and Ukraine was one of the first pieces to his imperial puzzle. As Russia began to build military forces around Ukraine in 2021, the asset Putin wielded best would begin to backfire on him, with lies about Russia's true combat capability, from the company level to the army level, grossly exaggerating Russia's ability to wage a war of aggression. It would also begin to paint Russia's intelligence assessments of Ukraine's military and civilian will to resist. Instead of recognizing Ukraine's years-long work to modernize and prepare for war, Russia would see the same weak state it saw in 2014. After decades of using lies to achieve his goals, Putin, believing lies about history, lies about his military, lies about NATO, and lies about Ukraine, ordered the invasion. Hundreds of thousands have died. Millions have been displaced. Ukraine has been destroyed but has managed to defend its independence as it did in 2014. Russia, a resurgent world power, has crumbled back to its lowest points since when Putin himself was back in Dresden, likely feeling the same emotions he felt now: fear, helplessness, and rage. His lies had turned on him, and as a result, his ambitions are falling apart before our very eyes.